Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to trace maps of conquests or count the jewels of emperors. Instead, we'll slip through a doorway veiled not by stone, but by silence, into chambers where history was embroidered in cotton and perfumed in rosewater. Here, the empire moved softly, not on the clash of swords, but on the rustle of reed blinds lifting at dawn. Not in decrees shouted from thrones, but in the steady geometry of folded towels, in hair combed with jasmine oil, in jewels sorted by the moods of light. The Zenana, the women's world of the Mughal court, was not a prison, nor quite a paradise. It was a city within walls, alive with incense, whispers, and rituals, so exact they felt like clockwork made of fragrance. Some said true power in the palace did not always sit on the peacock throne, but behind lattice screens where footsteps softened into secrets. Alliances were woven not only with ink and blood, but with silk and silence. So lower the lights. Let the hush of adder and sandalwood linger in your lungs. And if your breathing begins to slow, that's just the palace evening wrapping you in its folds. If quiet histories like this soothe you, you might consider subscribing. And if you share of a time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next lamp in the Zenana will be waiting for you there. And as the thought of that lamp flickers in your mind, imagine its glow spilling across cool marble, catching on steam that rises and braids. The night thins into dawn, and the palace shifts from dreams into ritual. Linen is folded with the precision of memory basins, Saya's water warms, and the day of the harem begins not with drums or proclamations, but with the quiet geometry of towels and the fragrance of rosewater drifting softly through the corridors. At dawn, the eunuch guards tapped brass staffs against stone to mark the change of watch, a sound as gentle as rain on a copper roof. Inside, attendants fanned incense through corridors until the air smelled faintly of rose attar, cardamom, and the patient soap of sandalwood. Servants lifted blinds made of woven reed so the morning light could enter politely, filtered through yali screens in patterns as decorative as lace and as practical as privacy. The queens woke slowly like well-fed cats, while the palace timekeepers counted the beats of the Nakara drums, and an imperial day stretched out, not in hours, but in small rituals that repeated so often they became comforting, like a lullaby hummed by the walls. If you're still awake by the time we reach the regulations for perfumed oil, feel wonderfully free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. The point is that life behind the veil did not rush. It hardly even walked. It glided. Baths were a lesson in temperature and patience. Water warmed in copper cauldrons until it remembered summer, then carried in brass ewers across marble floors that had been cooled with damp cloths overnight. The queen's hair was combed with small wooden combs rubbed with jasmine oil so they would catch but never snag. A favorite pastime, if we trust the diaries and the courtly manuals, was sorting jewels not by value but by the quality of their glint in slanting afternoon, light pearl for mornings, emerald for cloudy days, ruby for conversation. This was technically one of the earliest documented examples of using weather as a wardrobe consultant. Meals were slow lectures in texture. The rice could be long-grained pilaf that never once clung to itself, or a sticky milk porridge that clung to everything, including memory. The bread was thin enough to fold into quarters and thick enough to feel like a decision. Fruits came arranged in pyramids whose only purpose, aside from being eaten, was to demonstrate gravity to anyone too sleepy to remember it. There were rules for everything, including where to place a mango seed after you conceded defeat to its juiciness. The harem had schools as well. Lessons in calligraphy, in the classical Persian of ghazals, in arithmetic that mattered because accounts mattered, and in etiquette that mattered because everything did. Music drifted in like night breeze sitar strings, tuned so carefully that even silence felt well-tempered. One chronicler noted a queen who could identify the court musicians with her eyes closed by the way they exhaled before the first note. That is, admittedly, a rather committed hobby. Power in the Zenana was arranged like a set of nested boxes, each one painted with more precise flowers than the last. Senior queens had apartments with gardens that kept their own time through fountains, little clocks of water that reset with each breeze. The younger ladies learned the map of influence one whispered corridor at a time. The emperor, a distant sun with scheduled eclipses, did not simply wander in at random. Meetings were petitioned, arranged, witnessed. Desire here was not a storm. It was irrigation. Queens controlled it with the calm of gardeners, choosing when the channels opened and when they were stopped with a polite, jewel-heavy hand. They selected perfumes carefully, partly because scent carries farther than gossip, and partly because it lingers less. A dab of vetiver announced coolness, a ribbon of musk hinted at presence, and rosewater, always rosewater, said nothing at all and therefore everything. There were rules for a night as well, which sounds unromantic until you realize that rules are simply the polite packaging of chaos. After sunset, corridors dimmed to honey. Attendants walked with lamps shaded so the flame would not stare. The queen's rooms were ventilated through hidden vents, a practical detail that made whispering a game of currents. If a queen desired privacy, she could request the recorded company of stories instead, the literate hush of a reader, reciting verses of love that never once mentioned an actual body. To outsiders, this might seem the dullest sort of romance, but dullness has a way of preserving dignity. Even the carpets had instructions, fringe pointed inward to suggest welcome, fringe outward to suggest an evening dedicated to embroidery, which in this context was diplomacy but with silk thread. Beyond these measured luxuries lay the gossip that gave the palace its restless heartbeat. The court was a great filing cabinet of stories, and at the back were the folders marked "not for public reading." Secret meetings were sought with the same determination one uses to find shade in June. A glance at a screened balcony, an extra hibiscus placed in a courtyard pot, a servant sent across the gardens with a jug that was inexplicably empty. These were the footnotes of affection. The harem's geography made discretion an architectural discipline. If someone could cross 3 courtyards and not disturb a single pigeon, they had earned at least the right to a rumor. One princess, so the tale goes, trained a mynah bird to mimic the cough of a eunuch guard, a useful alarm and possibly the earliest recorded example of avian privacy technology. Correspondence was the other invisible hallway. Courtiers learned to write letters that would survive being opened by the wrong eyes. Phrases bent into safe shapes like rugs rolled for storage. A line such as "the jasmine blooms early" could mean tonight, or "the treasury audit went well," depending on whether the paper smelled faintly of saffron or of ink alone. It is tempting to imagine moonlight as the great accomplice here, but it was often scheduling that did the heavy lifting. The emperor, like any busy professional, had calendars. The queens, like any competent managers, knew when meetings ran late. A lamp left on one long minute longer than usual became a paragraph. Every court had its scandals, and the Mughal chronicles, while dignified, were not allergic to sensation. There were hearings where nothing was admitted and everything was understood. Servants were questioned and soft voices that suggested sympathy, while inventories were checked with the sharpness of a jeweler's loupe. A misplaced anklet could cause more conversation than a misplaced battalion. When a rumor swelled too large, it was shrunken by ceremony. A festival would be declared, the kitchens would produce sweets shaped like flowers. The musicians would play the old songs, and the narrative would politely back out of the room. The lesson was clear. A scandal handled with enough sugar tends to dissolve. Stories also gathered around queens who are remembered for their skill at persuasion, which is to say their skill at arranging facts until everyone nodded agreeably. They knew the emperor's preferences in paintings and garden walks, in the exact number of peppercorns that made a soup feel confident but not cocky. These are small skills, but small skills steer dynasties. A queen might mention a provincial appointment, while choosing inlay stones for a new pavilion, and the emperor, admiring a strip of agate that looked like a river at dusk, would agree to the proposal as if it were part of the design. If this sounds like manipulation, consider that it was also management. The empire was a very large household. Someone had to remember which cupboard held the cinnamon of policy and which one the cloves of compromise. Jealousies developed with the slow predictability of monsoon clouds. One lady's new bracelet seemed louder than another's poem. A gifted shawl felt like a footnote to a conversation you had not been included in. Occasionally, physicians were summoned and kitchens inspected, not for cooking advice, but for certainty. People feared powders more than they trusted promises. The chronicles are polite on these matters, but politeness is a kind of underline. A cup would be poured and then replaced. A taster, a professional paradox, would take a sip so that others could relax. When nothing happened, and very often nothing did, life resumed. It is, after all, fatiguing to suspect your cinnamon. Not all rivalries burned. Some just simmered like tea left near a sunny window. There were alliances stitched with shared visits to shrines, and with gifts of rare inks or clever recipes for cooling sherbets. The harem library grew heavy with anthologies annotated in different hands, marginalia that argued kindly across decades. In a world shaped by curtains, intellect traveled like fragrance. Queen sponsored poets and painters, and while the stories focus on love, much of this patronage was an empire of paperwork. Bills paid on time, pigments ordered in bulk, workshops kept in good cheer. One queen, the records say, insisted artisans take breaks in a garden shaded by melons grown specifically to be sliced at 4 o'clock. It is possible to be formidable and to schedule fruit. The reputation of scandalous queens owes something to later storytellers who loved a spicy moral more than a bland truth. Yet some women did indeed reshape the balance. A few took titles that lifted them from companions to governance. Padshah Begum was not a nickname but a portfolio. They wrote farmans with seals that pressed more than wax. They pressed precedent. One queen co-signed official orders as if the empire were a joint account, which in practice it was. Another organized relief during a famine, and then arranged to be remembered doing so, an early lesson in both logistics and public relations. To say they manipulated kings through seduction is to admit that earlier historians lacked a precise term for competence wrapped in charisma. Romance, when it refused to behave, sometimes did nudge the empire's furniture. A new fort might be placed where a favorite view happened to be. A campaign might pause for a festival because the emperor liked the way torches trembled on water. These are not disasters. They are human-colored revisions. And then there were quieter corrections. A queen asking for a canal to be redug so the orchards would not thirst. A decision that pleased future apples and therefore future diplomats. Desire here was not a villain. It was simply another advisor, draped in perfume and plausible deniability. As the centuries turned, tastes changed like music shifting ragas. What earlier emperors found dazzling, later ones found a touch excessive. What had seemed pious abstention began to feel like missed opportunity. The gardens, once severe in their symmetry, allowed vines to wander a little. Queens who had grown up with strict schedules now sponsored entertainments that lasted past midnight. Circles of poetry, games of pachisi played with shell counters heavy enough to keep score and light enough to never feel final. The harem's rhythm, once a careful metronome, loosened to a waltz. When people say desire-shaped decline, they often mean expense accounts, or distractions, or simply the comfortable gravity that pulls any gilded world toward its cushions. But decline is a strong word for what often looked like softness. Beyond the palaces, the world raised its own eyebrows. Foreign merchants arrived with cloth that claimed to be impossible, and clocks that claimed to be right. Diplomats wrote home about the queens with a tone that suggested both fascination and a limited vocabulary. A traveler might hear that nocturnal meetings were common and imagine melodrama, when in fact the meetings were usually committees with good snacks. The empire shifted shape under pressure from many things, taxation that oozed instead of flowed, generals who preferred poetry, governors who mistook patience for permanence. The Zenana reflected these changes like a polished metal plate reflects a face, slightly bent, always flattering, never wrong enough to argue with. Legacy, in the end, is a drawer where later generations put whatever does not fit elsewhere. The scandalous queens left legacies of architecture and administration, of charities and schools, of rugs whose borders hold more geometry than some treatises. They also left stories that yawn and stretch in the late hours, tales that substitute a lace handkerchief for a ledger and call it history. If you listen closely, you can still hear the practical notes. A schedule written in margin of a poem. A recipe for rose sherbet that doubles as a summer policy. Advice to a young lady on how to manage her attendance and, by extension, her province. The empire was large. The harem was precise. No one truly knows which rumor had the sharpest teeth, or which queen raised an eyebrow at exactly the right time to tip a policy into place. The records are full of careful phrases and beautiful scripts, lines that bend around the facts as politely as courtyards bend around fountains. Perhaps the most accurate detail we can rescue is the sound of anklets on marble, a punctual music that said, "Here comes someone who understands that power." Like perfume, should arrive a moment before the wearer turns the corner. A historian might wish for clearer evidence, but bedtime is not the hour for footnotes. It is the hour for a slow parade of images. Copper ewers steaming gently, window screens embroidering the moon, a hand setting down a letter with a seal still warm. If you are still awake, there is one more small, unnecessary detail. The ivory inlaid game boards used by some queens had tiny storage drawers for the counters. Each drawer lined with velvet in a different color green for spring, yellow for summer, blue for the monsoon, and maroon for the mild melancholy of winter afternoons. One can picture a queen contemplative, sliding open the monsoon drawer even on a dry day, inviting rain to the table as an imaginary opponent. It is not a scandal, nor is it evidence of decline. It is a human gesture, precise and a little whimsical, which is what most of history looks like, when the torches are low and everyone has stopped speaking in their official voices. So the story hums on, in an even tone that does not accuse or absolve, only describes. Fine muslin hangs where it always has, diffusing both light and opinion. Somewhere a reader continues a tale begun 2 centuries ago, and a listener, lulled by the cadence, forgets which names belong to emperors, which to queens, and which to the servants who noticed everything and recorded almost nothing. The palace is quiet enough to hear the fountains reset themselves, the lamps nod, the night folds in like a neat shawl, and even the gossip, that nimble creature, curls up and dozes at the foot of the bed, at least until the next morning's drums tap the marble again. You might not expect the angle of a jolly screen to change the mood of an empire, but a half degree of lattice could decide how much mourning touched a queen's wrist, and therefore whether the day felt like silk or like starch. Behind the veil, life in the Mughal Zenana began with small negotiations between light and shadow. Attendants lifted reed blinds in careful increments, as if sunlight were a curious guest who needed a polite introduction. Brass ewers sighed as steam escaped, and somewhere in a corridor a eunuch tapped a staff against stone. One measured note to say the watch had changed. The palace was awake, and slippers, not shoes, were now the law. Pillows were plumped with more conviction than many petitions. Quilts breathed out the scent of adder trapped since dusk. And the marble floors remembered the night's coolness the way a book remembers a pressed flower faintly and with good manners. If you're still awake by the time I begin alphabetizing hair oils, feel wonderfully free to subscribe. Or don't. I assume you dozed off, which counts as a 5-star review in this very specialized genre. The point is that the harem's mornings were unhurried, because precision dislikes haste. A comb made of sandalwood passed through hair already coached with jasmine and coconut, and the gentle creak it made was practically policy. Scarves were chosen not just by color, but by how they behaved in drafts. Some fabrics loved crosswinds, and some took offense. Breakfast arrived as tiny decisions. Thin breads folded like letters, pomegranates opened along the fault lines nature had kindly engraved. Milk warmed until it forgot it had ever been cold. A queen might weigh a slice of mango in her hand the way a treasurer weighs a coin, approving ripeness with a nod that had toppled more than one budget. Power in these rooms traveled along the quiet channels of desire, which is to say schedules. The emperor was busy, and so, more importantly, were the queens. Access was choreographed with the gentleness of a garden fountain, not so forceful as to splash, not so timid as to sulk. Desire that arrived on time felt respectable. Desire that arrived unscheduled felt like weather, and the palace preferred climate. Perfumes became memos that ever sent a breeze of restraint. Musk, used properly, hinted at a meeting that would likely run long. Rosewater said nothing, which is why it said everything. There was even a rule about how many steps a bearer should take after opening a scent bottle, so the fragrance would meet the emperor and not merely precede him, which would have been rude and, worse, inefficient. Queens supervise such details because they understood the obvious secret. Attention is a treasury. Whoever budgets, it decides which provinces receive rain. Libraries soft the afternoons. Pages whispered in Persian and Hindavi, and sometimes in a well-behaved Turkish that never raised its voice. Poetry rehearsed feelings so they could be delivered later without spilling, like sherbet in a shallow silver bowl. Music drifted through screens so finely carved that even sound seemed to wear embroidery. Harp-like notes rubbed shoulders with lesson plans. A dance master counted beats in the next courtyard. A parrot tried to learn the names of gemstones and got stuck on emerald, which is a wonderfully stubborn word. The instruments themselves were polished by attendants who knew the difference between shine and glare. There was a recipe for everything, including the proper dust for the strings of a sitar and the proper silence to offer a newly tuned drum. It is difficult to be scandalous when the tempo's this polite, but the palace did its best. Desire, of course, likes corridors. After dusk, the palace drew its shawl across the shoulders of the air, and lamps were shaded to a gentler gold. The screens became constellations. Each perforation was a star that did not have to prove anything. Eunuchs walked their paths with the steady patience of clocks you can hear, and keys chimed softly on their rings as if they were tiny wind bells. If a meeting was to be arranged, it moved like water in irrigation channels, through sanctioned turns, announced by small eddies of courtesy. A queen could request a reading instead of a visit, which meant the night would be full of love poems that artfully forgot to mention bodies. In the ledger of propriety, this counted as expense under entertainment, rather than policy, which was accurate and also convenient. Yet there were other paths, the sort that are not drawn on official maps, but are carefully memorized by people who are good at remembering. A screen balcony might display an extra hibiscus, tilted exactly toward the garden where a certain person was likely to stroll. A musician might linger 2 beats longer in a known doorway, apparently entranced by tuning, actually entranced by something else entirely. Attendants became punctuation marks. A particularly trusted maid, carrying a lamp with a hooded flame, could be a semicolon. A door left fractionally ajar, a comma. The faint cough of a guard down the hall, a prudent full stop. The great conspirator was not passion but scheduling. When the emperor had a late council with the treasurer, half the palace discovered it suddenly had ideas about moonlight. The stories that reached the record books were formal close. They speak of disturbances and whispers, words that fold neatly and do not show their seams. Under those words live smaller details, a bracelet that had been seen earlier on one wrist reappearing on another, a pair of slippers hiding under the wrong divan, a poem copied in a hand that did not match its reader. One diarist notes a mango seed found in a courtyard drain on a month when mangoes were decidedly unfashionable. Historians debate whether this counts as evidence or merely as seasonal optimism. There were inquiries, of course, but they proceeded as if in filled slippers. Servants were questioned in rooms whose windows opened onto fountains because water was believed to dissolve embarrassment. Often, the verdict was less a verdict than a rearrangement of cushions. People were moved to different quarters. Schedules were refreshed. A new series of entertainments was commissioned. A scandal, treated with enough sugar and music, tends to melt. Queens understood that seduction, when it becomes strategy, is simply an elegant word for listening. They remembered which wine the emperor called for when faced with too many documents, which garden provoked agreeable decisions, which story softened his mood toward a stubborn province. A dinner might begin with the lentils he trusted, move toward the apricots that reminded him of a favorable treaty, and conclude under a fresco painted in a pigment he once praised. While he admired a border of pietra dura that looked exactly like a river at dusk, a small administrative suggestion could glide into conversation like a boat that never once forgot its oars. It sounds manipulative in the brisk language of reports. In the softer language of late evening, it was household management at imperial scale. Jealousy traveled through the zenana like a well-bred cat, seldom noisy, always present, occasionally knocking something over that was definitely not an accident. A new shawl, a poem too pointedly dedicated to a certain star, a sitar lesson that continued a fraction past the sensible hour, any of these could ruffle tempers. When tempers ruffled, physicians were consulted with the seriousness normally reserved for eclipse omens. Kitchens were inspected, not because cooks were careless, but because caution was fashionable. Small silver spoons were dipped into dishes by tasters, a profession composed entirely of paradox and gratitude. Spices themselves became suspects. Cinnamon sighed under interrogation, cloves kept their counsel. Sometimes the solution, if we trust the ledgers, was to order a great many sweets and distribute them widely. Sugar, the empire discovered, is a persuasive diplomat. Rivalries produced alliances, and alliances produced festivals, and festivals produced budgets that included wine. Items like dye for kites, and extra shade for the chess table near the Gulmahar, which is how you know an empire is thriving. Queens collaborated on charities that built mosques and schools. They endowed gardens where fruit was scheduled to ripen in a curriculum of color. They bought manuscripts and then paid copyists to repeat them so that the words would travel farther than the breeze. When later storytellers filed these women under scandal, they forgot to include the invoices. One queen organized famine relief with the brisk tenderness of a headmistress, grain tallied, carts assigned, routes chosen not for romance but for passable roads. Another insisted artisans be fed almonds at 4 o'clock sharp to sharpen their hands. It is hard to find the indecency in punctual nuts, but people have tried. Still, desire made history tilt in ways that memo writers could not entirely straighten. A pavilion might be placed where the view made conversation kinder. A military departure might wait for a festival because the emperor preferred to leave on a day when marigolds were everywhere. And who can argue with marigolds? A canal was redug so orchards would not sulk. Orchards responded with peaches, which persuaded more than one governor to sign agreeable papers. When jealousies sharpened, rooms changed function. A music chamber became a library for a season. A garden walk altered by the addition of a single bench produced a different kind of evening. None of this constitutes the thunderclap of downfall. It is the soft weather of power, part perfume, part habit, mostly human. Later eras like their stories with stronger spices. They titled chapters with words like perverse, because quiet influence does not sell chapbooks. Yet the legacy of these queens is numbered in architecture, in laws sealed with a second careful hand, in charities that kept the poor from sinking quite so low in difficult years. Some carried the title Pacha Begum, which was not a nickname but a job description with a seal and a staff and the authority to sign. A few co-issued orders, an imperial duet that made administrators sit a little straighter. When foreign visitors wrote home, they sometimes mistook organization for seduction and paperwork for perfume. It is an understandable translation error. Perfume lingers, so does a policy. Did desire shape the empire's decline? It helped the decline keep a comfortable schedule. The treasury noticed that festivals cost more when lanterns were imported from cities that bragged about their glass. Generals developed opinions about poetry that were perhaps too strong for men who spent so much of the budget on horses. Governors learned that postponing decisions to accommodate a moonlit recital was strangely satisfying, especially when the recital featured a particularly good raga in the second half. Tastes changed, marble multiplied. Gardens traded strict geometry for vines that took liberties. None of this ruined an empire that was already busy doing that work the old-fashioned way, through taxation that creaked, logistics that sulked, and provinces that remembered they could say no. What lingers is a quieter curriculum, a way of arranging a room so that conversation knows where to sit, a habit of sealing letters with 2 cents, one for business, one for optimism. A suspicion that jealousy can be coaxed into friendship with the right gift of paper and ink. There are recipes for sherbets that taste like benevolent policy. There are lists of jewels grouped not by price, but by the kind of afternoon they adore. I have seen, in a museum, a game board with small drawers lined in velvet of 4 colors: green for spring, yellow for summer, blue for the monsoon, and maroon for the dignified yawn of winter. One can imagine a queen sliding open the monsoon drawer on a dry day and inviting rain to play pachisi. Best of 3, no wagering. Winner takes bragging rights and the south-facing balcony. Some nights it is said the palace still hums. Marble remembers footsteps even after centuries of silence. Screens keep their private star maps. A parrot in an old painting continues to say emerald forever, trapped on its favorite syllable. Somewhere behind glass, a silver spoon that once confirmed the safety of an almond pudding shines with unearned pride. The chronicles, when you read them at a yawn-friendly hour, are less about wickedness than about maintenance, how to keep a household large as a country from unraveling, how to steer attention without tipping the boat. The queens did not always get what they wanted, but they often got what they scheduled, which is more repeatable and therefore more useful. If you've drifted off by now, that is perfectly respectable. If you're hovering between sleep and history, here is a last unnecessary detail to carry you across. The palace timekeepers tuned the Nakara drums at sunset by laying thin slices of dough on the skins to soften the tone. The dough was later fried and given to the youngest attendants as a treat. That is the empire in miniature: management, music, and snacks. Lamps narrow to pearls, fountains reset. The air loosens its knots, and even the most persistent rumor curls up like a cat at the end of the bed, purring softly, waiting for the staff's tap at dawn to start the whole gentle machinery again. You might not expect the width of a silk sash to settle a political question, but in the Mughal palaces, a handspan could mean the difference between a private audience and a politely postponed afternoon. The day inside the imperial women's quarters began with negotiations that were not quite laws and not quite preferences. The sort of customs that grew like ivy and, being graceful, were rarely questioned. Screens woke before people did. Their geometric shadows slid across marble like very calm fish, and servants raised the reed blinds by measured inches so that the sunlight arrived in increments, not unlike a courtier, never early, never unannounced, always scented. Brass ewers, warm against towels, exhaled little clouds. Water fell in a steady pulse into basins that remembered the night's cool. The sound was practical yet theatrical, like an orchestra tuning forks before the first note. A queen's hair was unwound from the night and combed with sandalwood teeth that knew patience, and the comb's soft tick-tick-tick kept time with the recitations from a corridor where a tutor reviewed verses that everyone already knew but liked to hear again. If you still awake by the time I begin ranking the varieties of rose adder by their opinion of humidity, feel generously free to subscribe. Or don't. Drifting off counts as enthusiastic agreement in this particular Academy of Sleep. The mornings here were busy, but the busyness moved in the slow grammar of ritual. With each step of grooming, a tiny empire clicked into place. Veils were chosen not just for hue, but for their behavior in light. Some silk dazzled too quickly and was filed under festive, while others accepted illumination like a compliment and were marked sensible. There were rules about the order of ornaments, too. Anklets might precede bracelets, except on days designated for public recitations, when bracelets, being more audible, were advanced to the front of the parade. Breakfast was more inventory than feast, thin breads folded with almost bureaucratic precision, pomegranates halved exactly along their quiet constellations, a delicate yogurt stirred 17 times because 15 felt rushed and 20 felt showy. Even the carpets had moods. Certain knots favored contemplative steps, others encouraged decisive errands, and this was taken into account when arranging a morning. If power were perfume, it was discretion. Queens and senior ladies were stewards of access, and access was the currency that does not look like money. The emperor lived, as emperors do, inside a calendar that wanted to be everybody's best friend. The women managed that calendar with the confident kindness of head librarians who know where the good pages are. Desire use whatever shy word you prefer, affection, attention. The agreeable warmth of being in the right company operated on timetables. A note delivered after the account's review might be read with a less wrinkled brow than the same note delivered before. A performance scheduled for the last crescent of the moon sounded better to men who distrusted even numbers. Perfumes became memos. Rosewater said, "General inquiries." A touch of musk meant this could run long. Sandal told the truth whether asked or not. The air itself became a quiet bulletin board, and the queens curated it with tender fussiness. It may look like luxury. It was administration with better upholstery. Music softened the edges of daylight, as it tends to do in places that can afford both music and edges. Lessons happened in rooms that were half courtyard, half echo, so every string found a friendly wall to lean on. The teachers tuned by listening to pigeons because pigeons, unlike people, do not hurry when they are correct. A parrot in a far room recited gemstone names and routinely stalled at emerald, which is stubborn even for a bird. Reading hours were conducted with the heavy gentleness of rain threatening to begin. Poetry was considered both entertainment and equipment. A queen who could quote the right couplet at the right moment did not need to raise her voice. The couplet did the lifting. Pages turned like boats making a deliberate U-turn on a calm lake. If anyone asked what purpose all this served, the answer presented itself exactly the way sunlight found the floor through the lattice, in neat little diamonds that added up, quietly, to a complete room. Evenings folded the palace into a soft geometry. Lamps were shaded to a gold that did not brag. Eunuchs conducted their rounds with the regularity of public clocks. Keys chimed in a way that was more reassurance than alarm. Everything that should be locked was, and everything that should open would when it had finished being admired. If there were meetings that required discretion, they looked like errands. A physician walked with a box of herbs that needed consultation. A musician carried a vina whose strings apparently demanded fresh air. A queen took a short stroll to admire a moonlit basin because the moon, like many celebrities, is handsomest in water. Attendants knew how to be punctuation marks. An extra servant could be a semicolon. A lamp turned half down could be a comma. The faint cough of a guard at the end of a corridor, a tactful period. In this grammar, affection traveled in complete sentences, and scandal tried, with varying success, to fit itself into parentheses. Chroniclers later described forbidden affairs, but their ink preferred official nouns to human verbs. The reality was less fireworks than footnotes. A barred shawl returned, scented with a perfume slightly different from the one that had departed. A book reopened to a page that had not been yesterday's. A mango pit discovered in a month, when mangoes were either early or very optimistic. People were moved, as furniture is, to better rooms. Schedules were adjusted as one adjusts cushions. The palace was a master of the cooling measure. When things felt warm, they were invited to take the air in a new courtyard. The few scandals that rose high enough to meet a scribe's ladder still sound, at this drowsy distance, like administrative headaches rather than operas. There were inquiries about keys. There were debates about slippers. There was a sudden flurry of interest in the night habits of hibiscus blossoms, which, to their credit, did not testify. Of course, desire has its little workshops where it makes tools out of patience. Seduction, in a place with as many microphones of marble, was less about the swerve than the steady turn. A queen learned when the emperor, Esmine, left the battlefield and entered the garden, usually 3 morsels into a certain dish. When the cinnamon proposed friendship to the almonds, she learned that setting a conversation under a fresco of a river caused his answers to wind rather than leap. Unwinding answers make room for suggestions. She learned which raga soothed his stubbornness and which one made mathematics seem friendly. A glance is powerful in poetry. In palaces, refreshments do the heavy lifting. The point was not conquest. It was choreography. If a petition could be persuaded to dance rather than march, everyone arrived less tired and more agreeable. Jealousy patrolled the zenana like a beautifully brushed cat, noticeable, dignified, rarely loud unless confronted by another cat with equally impressive whiskers. A compliment too frequently repeated became a rumor with better posture. A gift with too many sapphires acquired a history by noon. Rivalries bloomed like seasonal flowers, all color and calendar, predictable enough to budget for. There were known remedies. One could commission a new poem in which virtues were distributed like festival sweets. 1 couplet each, nobody left hungry, everyone sugared. One could stage a concert and sit rivals side by side, secure in the knowledge that complicated rhythms require cooperation. When measures failed, there were the physicians. They catalogued ailments with the seriousness of astronomers. Heat of the liver, they said, gazing at a woman who had misplaced a bracelet and found a grievance. Melancholy of the spleen, they murmured, prescribing saffron milk and an afternoon without visitors. When gossip mentioned poison, it usually meant spices behaving melodramatically. Cloves are famous for their ability to look guilty while doing nothing at all, and yet there were darker footnotes. The kitchens kept tasters, whose work combined prudence with culinary curiosity. Recipes were stored like treaties, amended in cautious increments. 1 more cardamom pod, half a dram less mace. A polite note that almonds should be blanched under supervision. Attendants learned to deliver trays with both grace and a memory for where the trays had been before. But even here the scale remained domestic. The dramas that later historians loved to amplify were, in their time, the sort of irritations that well-run households handle by opening windows. If a scandal grew, it seldom did so alone. Money and power are companion climbers. When they tangled with desire, the vine was easily blamed for the trellis's old age. The queen's influence reached past courtyards. Some acted as patrons of schools in the cities where their families had roots and the accounts. Books show scholarships disguised as festivals, because festivals were the acceptable way to move large sums from the treasury into public good while producing garlands everyone could applaud. Others organized pilgrimages in which logistics were miracles disguised as piety. Mules, water skins, dry rations, road repairs, all signed by hands perfumed just enough to be remembered fondly. A few co-signed rail orders, which made governors stare at the paper a moment longer, the way one pauses before a good carpet, appreciative of the knots. Visitors called this charm. The bookkeeping calls it governance. The palace called it Tuesday. When later writers speak of queens who manipulated kings through seduction, they are telling the truth the way a mirror tells a room, accurately but incompletely. The quieter truth is that these women learned how to be audible at the correct frequency. The emperor's day included horses, petitions, princes, and leather, none of which is famous for yielding easily. If a song eased a door, if a rosewater sherbet escorted a sentence to its destination, the accomplishment belongs to the composer and the cook as much as to a blink and a smile. I am required by the ancient laws of bedtime to mention one deliciously unnecessary anecdote. There was a protocol for the number of steps an attendant took after opening a perfume vial, so that fragrance met the emperor and did not rush at him. Somewhere in that choreography is the whole story. Did all this desire, groomed and costumed and shod in soft shoes, nudge the empire downward? It helped the slope feel comfortable. Lanterns became more imported. Marble grew enthusiastic. A pavilion, placed where it made conversation kinder, required maintenance, and maintenance requires silver that might otherwise have ridden out with an army. The court's ear for music sharpened. Its ear for frontier complaints occasionally did not. Generals developed opinions about verse. Tax collectors learned the ragas that made complaints sound less reasonable. But empires, like carpets, wear from many directions at once. From feet, from sun, from the accidents of ink, desire's footprint is small. It is the teacup stain on an old decree visible, round, not the reason the decree was ignored, but the part everyone notices because it makes a better story. The legacies that stayed are the ones that fold easily into daily life. Gardens arranged to teach patience by ripening in a thoughtful sequence. Baths styled in patterns that make conversation soften its corners. A rule that letters should be sealed with 2 cents, one for what is said and one for how the sender hopes it will be heard. An endowment for widows disguised as a poetry festival. A music room with a ceiling painted like a listening ear. Queens taught by example that affection can be archived in schools, in wells, in hospitals, in bridges that carry more than horses. Their monuments are not always domes, often they're schedules. If a city eats on time, someone in silk may have planned it. And now we are near the end that is not an ending so much as a long hallway whose lamps agree to dim a little. The palace rests. Screens remember the passage of small breezes. The parrot tries emerald again and gets distracted by the pleasing shape of its own claws. A forgotten shawl waits on the back of a chair and dreams, if shawls do, of being the solution to a minor problem in a chilly dawn. Somewhere a drumskin relaxes. Somewhere a key, relieved of its day, begins to sound less like a promise and more like a souvenir. If your eyelids are heavy, that is historically appropriate. These are not the sorts of queens who wake a world with declarations. They are the ones who keep a world from stumbling by knowing where to place a cushion. Before sleep, a final gentle absurdity. The Nakar drums used to announce the imperial appearance were tuned at sunset by placing small discs of dough on the skins. The dough cooled the pitch and went eventually to the youngest attendants as a fried treat, which is a respectable metaphor for the whole institution. Administration that feeds someone. We are back where we began, with a silk sash whispering decisions into the day. The sash is folded. The marble breathes out the last of its chill. The screens collect stars in their patient geometry. What the records call scandal turns over and becomes simply arrangement. And you, traveling the quiet corridors of the mind, can let the last lamp shade itself, and the last fountain practice its small, even sentences, and the music stay in its box until morning, when the first comb will tick, 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 and history will rise again, very slowly, as if careful not to wake you. You might not expect the angle of a lattice shadow to decide who spoke with an emperor, but in the Mughal palaces, a few degrees of light could tilt an afternoon. Morning seeped into the harem, the way tea leans into a cup, quietly and with the faintest fragrance of cardamom. Lamps were pinched out one by one, each with a tiny cap of copper, and servants padded across floors so polished that the air felt careful around them. The veil, which outsiders imagine as a heavy curtain, behaved more like a polite idea. It moved when it needed to and settled when conversation wished to be private. Baskets of jasmine arrived the way news does in well-ordered places, on time, in good condition, with small notes attached that looked like compliments but were actually instructions. Someone counted pearls, always in pairs, never in threes, because threes made questions, and someone else argued gently about whether sandalwood combs should be oiled before or after they had their tiny daily sun bath on a windowsill. A parrot, whose job title was vague but whose authority was obvious, recited the names of sweets and forgot one every day, as if there must always be a reason to listen again tomorrow. If you're still awake by the time I sort lamp oil into 5 grades of brightness, feel free to subscribe, or simply allow your eyelids to design the decision. Either way, no paperwork is required. Life behind the veil ran on a measured rhythm that married luxury to logistics. Baths were drawn at precise temperatures, not so hot that Bengals protested, not so cool that poetry became difficult. Silk was brushed with feathers rather than fingers because feathers never hinted at hurry. The courtyards kept different personalities, like a family of soft-spoken ants, one for quiet meals, one for music, one for the inspection of fabrics whose reputations were nearly as important as their threads. There were household debates that sounded grand and were not. Should the saffron be kept near the pepper to teach it boldness, or near the sugar to encourage humility? How many steps ought a servant take after uncorking a perfume vial so the scent reached its intended listener just as the listener completed a sentence? It was decided, after an endearing amount of thought, that 7 steps made arguments seem solvable. Desire, which historians blame for everything because it cannot write letters denying involvement, was audited here like any other resource. The queens, some by birth, some by wit, some by the soft luck that follows discipline, managed attention the way treasurers manage coins. The emperor's time moved in polite constellations, and they tended those stars with the patience of gardeners who know which flowers open on which evenings. A glance was the least of it. There were playlists before there were phonographs. Morning ragas reserved for reviewing petitions. Afternoon ragas for soothing arithmetic. Night ragas for matters that preferred latitude. There were drinks that slowed a conversation delicately, like rain lengthening a path, and little almond cakes that made a story jump to the interesting part. Protocols looked like ribbons and tasted like sherbet, but they were bones, not decorations. Why did the queens control desire? Because they controlled quiet, and quiet, in a palace with armies on the other side of the wall, is its own artillery. By evening, the palace softened to a map of possibilities. Keys whispered down corridors in the hands of eunuchs, who specialized in the art of being exactly where questions did not wish to arise. Lanterns turned light into syrup. Screens cast patterns on floor cushions as if planning a gentle chess match that would never require a winner. In this twilight grammar, privacy became a verb. A chair might privacy someone. A walk might privacy 2 people just long enough for a petition to remember what it wanted. Musicians tuned with the help of pigeons. Pigeons never hurry when correct, and the air arranged itself in bands. One for singing, one for conversation, and a very small one for secrets that preferred to be almost noticed. The harem, often explained as walls, was in practice a language. Those fluent could speak in rosewater and receive answers in sandalwood without once appearing impolite. Chroniclers later wrote about hidden lovers as if the palace were a masquerade. The reality was quieter and more procedural, like shifting furniture by the width of a teacup, so a room suddenly behaved. Meetings that were not meetings presented as errands. A physician made his rounds with a box of herbs that needed sunlight between the second and third courtyard. A book demanded to be returned to the library at an hour it had not asked for yesterday. An attendant escorted an unnecessary shawl because the moon, though sovereign of tides, has a notorious draft. Timing did the heavy lifting. If a conversation began when the north wind snuck through the eastern Yali, one could discuss plans while pretending to discuss breezes. If a pause arrived just as the water clock released its fourth drop, a sigh could be filed as a coincidence. Secrets thrived best when they resembled housekeeping. Scandals did occur, of course, but they rarely wore the costumes later writers assigned them. They looked, in their own century, like administrative riddles. A key that traveled without its owner, a ring discovered where rings did not normally nap, a sleeve lacking the crease it had collected every afternoon for years. Eunuchs convened committees. Committees convened lists. Lists convened the soothing air of inevitability. The palace preferred remedies to revelations. People were relocated to rooms that improved their opinion of sleep. Lamp routes were redrawn with the sort of seriousness roads receive in countries that adore maps. Perfume recipes were adjusted a single drop at a time until they smelled like caution. The most dramatic punishments are the least reusable. The harem specialized in reusable solutions. Still, desire is a small engineer. It learns the palaces it inhabits and rearranges them by millimeters. The queens who knew the emperor best worked not with thunder but with weather. Seduction here was not a storm but a forecast. They studied which confection returned his courage after a difficult audience. The pistachio laddu, not the almond, because pistachio tastes like decisions that have already forgiven you. They noticed the exact measure of shade under the pomegranate tree that transformed his opinions from square to oval. They learned that one raga encouraged him to turn a petition sideways until its edges aligned. Another made him reach for a pen, as if the pen were part of the answer. They could change the temperature of a thought by the position of a cushion. If that sounds like enchantment, remember that enchantment is what administration looks like when it is very good at feelings. Rivalries padded through the zenana with the composure of cats that have earned their reputations. Compliments circulated like coins. When one stayed in a single purse too long, inflation announced itself. Jealousy took measurements no tailor ever requested. The wise anecdotes were ancient and charming. Stage a reading where the poem gave every virtue a stanza and made generosity rhyme with your name here. Commission a set of miniature paintings in which favorite rivals looked, by strict artistic necessity, equally luminous. The painter received a bonus in the form of never being dragged into disputes about eyelashes. Convene a game with rules so finicky that cooperation outweighed competition. When none of this sufficed, physicians were invited to rename emotions as digestible disorders. Heat of the liver, they said gravely, prescribing roasted fennel seeds and a story that ends without ending. Spleen dampness, they added, which sounded convincing even to people who did not have a spleen at hand. Poison hovered in gossip like smoke from a lamp that refuses to go to bed. The kitchens answered smoke with procedures. Tasters who combined bravery with excellent palates sampled dishes in a sequence that would have made an accountant proud. Spices were logged as if they were dignitaries. Cardamom arrived escorted by clove. Cinnamon signed its name with a flourish. Saffron hid behind its price and was asked to show identification twice. Recipes read like treaties. Add one pod, unless the pod looks theatrical, in which case request a second opinion. The palace had no patience for melodrama from ingredients. When a rumor insisted that a cup had carried malice, the cup was examined with the seriousness glassware receives only in households where glassware can ruin evenings. Most crimes of the tongue turned out to be crimes of storage. Anything left too near asafoetida acquires a suspicious character. Among the queens remembered for cleverness, some learned to speak to the emperor in the dialect of his day. On mornings shaped by military reports, they used the grammar of marching, short sentences, accurate maps, tea that tasted like crisp decisions. On afternoons softened by music, they spoke in crescents, offering choices that bent toward mercy. On festival evenings, they let administrators believe they had invented generosity. Seduction, if we must keep the word, LIVED inside strategy, the way scent lives inside rosewater, entirely present, yet hard to separate without destroying the thing. A drift of anklet bells could recalibrate an argument. A pause placed like a cushion allowed a man to sit down on his own conclusion and congratulate himself. If this is manipulation, then so is a compass. It simply knows where north is and points without raising its voice. The legacy of these women runs along lines that bureaucrats recognize but rarely celebrate. Schools appeared where festivals had left a surplus of good feeling. Wells were dug because the Queen's pilgrimage needed water, and everyone else was now welcome to drink. Hospitals learned the palace, as love of procedure, and began labeling herbs with the calm penmanship of people who expect to be consulted. Endowments were wrapped in ceremonies, the way gifts are wrapped when their contents are practical and their recipients sentimental. The best administrators make kindness look like inevitability. The queens practiced this until it could be taught. Visitors praised the music and the carpets. The music and the carpets quietly introduced them to hygiene, punctuality, and receipts. Did such carefully tended affection tilt the empire downward? Perhaps it taught comfort to expect applause. Silk multiplied where iron might have been content. Kitchens learned new confections while arsenals learned patience. Governors began composing verses in their heads during tax audits, which can be productive only in very specific meters. Architecture developed a taste for reflection pools that reflected not only buildings but budgets. But decline is a chorus, not a solo. Desire sang its line. So did distance, inheritance, climate, and the universal human hobby of being just a little too pleased with yesterday. If luxury weakened anything, it was the habit of surprise. The empire became very good at expecting excellence from its own cushions. A few queens wrote themselves into law, not with signatures but with habits. A daily audience for petitioners who preferred to speak to someone who listened first and decided later. A morning hour during which any woman of the city could bring a complaint and know it, would be carried over thresholds where some complaints find their shoes glued to the floor. A tradition of copying favorite poems in a particular slant that scribes adopted because it made ink look thoughtful. These are small acts, the sort that rarely receive statues, but they are the corners of rooms where a society rests. Where scandals seem to rule, steadiness secretly governed, as steadiness so often does. Night, at last, gathered the palaces into their gentlest shapes. The parrot practiced the names of gemstones and forgave itself for mistranslating emerald. Lattice stitched moonlight into rectangles that fit the floor as if measured, which of course they were. The last viewer inhaled its own steam in a humble triumph over cool air. Somewhere, a musician rewrapped a string around a peg with the care of someone winding tomorrow. The veil mail meant what it often means at the end of a long day, permission to stop editing the world. If your eyes are heavy, you are keeping the right company. Palaces do not shout themselves to sleep. They murmur inventory. Before the lamps go fully dark, a final soft absurdity that a chronicler almost included and then kindly forgot. The drum that announced imperial appearances was tuned at dusk with small discs of dough pressed onto the skin. The dough slipped the pitch downward to the exact note that told the city, not now, but soon. After tuning, the discs became snacks for junior attendants who acquired, quite literally, a taste for protocol. It is a neat summary of the age, administration fried into something edible. These queens, notorious in rumor and meticulous in practice, left behind a manual disguised as a melody and a city arranged to make sleep easy. The last footstep fades, the last key becomes only metal again, and the lattice lets in one more square of moon. Somewhere beyond the palace, history continues at a louder volume. Here, it lowers its voice, fluffs a cushion with 2 careful pats, and allows the night to proceed without hurry. You might not expect a kingdom to rise and fall on the rim of a teaspoon, but kitchens have toppled taller ideas with less. In the pale hush of an 18th century morning, somewhere between a kettle that has begun to think about boiling and a small, hopeful loaf, a cook peers into a drawer where spoons live like well-behaved minnows. No two are quite the same. One has a bowl like a moon sliver, another is round enough to suggest confidence. The recipe says a teaspoon of caraway, which is useful only if one knows how big a teaspoon intends to be today. This is the story of how a very small measure learned to stand still. If you're still awake by the time I start comparing the angles of spoon handles, feel free to subscribe or simply roll over and let your pillow handle the paperwork. I will proceed either way at the pace of a kettle finishing its sentence. The earliest teaspoons were not promises but suggestions. Apothecaries kept their own ideas about what a spoon meant, and cooks borrowed those ideas the way neighbors borrow ladders with gratitude and a private vow to return them quickly. One man's teaspoon could be a teaspoon in the liquid sense, or a teaspoon in the powdered sense, which behave like cousins who refuse to sit next to one another at supper. In a London shop, you might meet a pewter spoon whose bowl held as much as a small walnut. In Boston, one that held the memory of a walnut. Cooks learned to read spoons like weather. A heaped spoon said, "Let's be cheerful." A level spoon said, "Let's be accurate." A scant spoon said, "The jar is almost empty, but pride forbids us to admit it." Somewhere a steward wrote, with the solemnity reserved for ship logs, "Use the blue one." And a household understood exactly which spoon the blue one was, and what tragedies awaited the unwise substitution of the green. Measurement enjoyed its first great nap in monasteries, where everything from prayer to porridge ran on bells. The brothers kept jars of dried herbs, and the spoon they used for mint was not to be used for wormwood, not because of doctrine, but because wormwood is persuasive. The mint spoon over time absorbed a personality, always polished, faintly sweet, with a bowl a shade wider than necessary. It would be anachronistic to call it 5 milliliters. It would not be inaccurate to call it the occasional. When merchants later sold tea by the ounce and gossip by the breath, the household teaspoon began its patient audition. Tea asked for repetition, and repetition asked for furniture that behaved. Teaspoons, with their modest bowls and slender stems, entered drawers like well-dressed clerks who had learned the art of not being noticed. Out in the city, weights and measures officers walked from stall to stall with a toolkit that looked like a tiny orchestra, nested cups, marked rods, brass weights that made little thuds of authority, liquids obeyed, grains cooperated. Spoons, however, smiled politely and continued with their private lives. The law could define a yard. It could bully a pint into respectability. A teaspoon kept its secrets. Girly cookbooks, like friends who know we're trying, offered help that sounded like praise. A good teaspoon, they would say, or a small teaspoon, which is the measuring equivalent of telling a dancer to be medium graceful. A German housewife solved the matter with a ledger entry that read, 2 thimblefuls make 1 spoon for dishes that must never taste eager. The line is still legible, as if time itself admired her common sense. Then we come to the soft bureaucracy of the kitchen, the moment when one household decided that a spoon could be a citizen. Drawers were lined, spoons were grouped by temperament. Hooks were labeled with a confidence that implies former confusion. The teaspoon began to carry not only sugar but also a reputation. Its fit inside a jar mouth, its habit of standing in batter without falling over, the polite clicking sound it made when nested with its friends. These traits mattered. Someone, somewhere, perhaps a steward named Elias with a talent for charts, noticed that when the same small scoop of yeast returned each baking day, the bread began to tell time by aroma. The teaspoon was learning what it would become by repeating what it already was. Standardization arrives in most histories on horseback. Here, it came in an apron. The 19th century loved precision the way stationery loves lines. Chemistry was putting labels on phenomena that had previously been content to be phenomena. Doctors were tired of telling patients to take a spoonful of tonic and then watching those patients argue with their spoons. The apothecary's dram, the household dram, the cook's pinch, the arithmetic grew sleepy and then mutinous. Slowly, the notion that 3 teaspoons might behave as 1 tablespoon became not a rumor, but a gentle social norm. In some places, the tablespoon settled down at 15 milliliters. In others, 20. And still others, it wore a different jacket to every party, and no one complained because the cakes were delicious. This is how empires are really built, not by declarations, but by desserts that succeed more often than they fail. Cooks are philosophers in flour. They searched for leveling devices that didn't feel like chores. The back of a knife made an early career out of scraping. It traveled across the spoon's rim with the steady charm of a skater on a very small pond. Later, recipe writers began to whisper about level teaspoons, 2 words that turned opinion into architecture. A level teaspoon was proof that democracy can be persuaded to visit a bowl. It meant that a cake made in January would resemble a cake made in June, even if January had more opinions. In Boston, a certain school teacher of recipes insisted that measuring cups be standardized and that cups be filled to the brim and leveled, not coaxed. The spoon listened carefully. It had found a companion in the square-shouldered cup. In kitchens from Liverpool to Lucknow, the duet improved everybody's mood. If you find yourself awake enough to wonder whether sugar grains change the volume of a teaspoon depending on whether they are sulking or joyful, you are in excellent company. Some households solve this by tapping the spoon lightly on the rim of the jar, a gesture that should have had its own stanza in etiquette books. Others swore by the sweep, a simple motion in which the finger introduces the excess to the countertop, where it resembled a small lunar drift and was immediately collected by someone with coffee. A few radical innovators adopted the shake, which worked but offended the quiet instincts of people who believe that ingredients should never experience unnecessary fear. The spoon, patient as a gate hinge, allowed every method to claim victory as long as the pudding set. Spoon design widened the conversation to include matters of dignity. Early bowls were long ovals, suited to slipping into narrow spice jars, as if every kitchen had been designed by an optimist who disliked shoulders. Later bowls became rounder, accommodating both granulated sugar and liquids without sighing. Handles experimented with curves, some so pronounced that they looked like delicate question marks, as if the spoon itself had philosophical concerns. A delightful compromise emerged in the form of a straight handle with a slightly raised finial, useful for resting on saucer edges without committing to a slide. If these details seem unnecessary, you have understood the point. A teaspoon does its best work when nobody notices that it has considered everything. To this day, there are spoons whose handles taper just enough to suggest that they would have been good at diplomacy. Meanwhile, in medical cabinets, confusion staged small plays. A teaspoon of laudanum was not an idea one wanted to improvise. Physicians, who never lack abbreviations when they need them, began speaking in minims and milliliters. Bottles sprouted lines like very tidy trees. Spoons lost a small jurisdiction and quietly kept the larger one, comfort. Even when the medicine moved to calibrated droppers, mothers still promised a little spoonful of honey after, with a teaspoon that had seen better evenings and would see many more. The spoon, relieved of dangerous ambiguity, returned to its hobbies of stirring, measuring, and supporting arguments about whether nutmeg is enthusiastic or merely confident. It is possible that civilization is the story of how many problems we can persuade a teaspoon not to solve. Cookbooks responded to this new steadiness by becoming more conversational. They could afford to be. A teaspoon of salt now meant something that did not require a family meeting. Recipe writers spent their saved words on tone and kindness. Add a teaspoon of vanilla if you have it, one wrote, which is the culinary equivalent of offering a chair. The teaspoon became the smallest unit of permission. 3 teaspoons to a tablespoon. 16 tablespoons to a cup. Kitchens began to hum with arithmetic that a sleepy person could enjoy doing. In Australia, a tablespoon decided to be 20 milliliters and announced its independence with the cheerful logic of a country that likes sun. No one scolded. Spoons have always known that geography is part of taste. Whispers persisted about the proper behavior of heaping and rounded. A heaping teaspoon looks like optimism with a handle. A rounded teaspoon looks like caution that has agreed to dress in carnival clothes. The level teaspoon, with its modest horizon, maintained the unglamorous empire of cake. Households developed traditions. One family heaped cinnamon but leveled baking powder. Another leveled everything but salt, on the theory that salt would correct other people's mistakes if it felt flattered. Argument was friendly and permanent. Somewhere, a child learning to measure discovered the great truth that a teaspoon of cocoa powder seems like less than a teaspoon of cocoa powder eaten with the teaspoon. This, technically, is the first recorded instance of someone being gently corrected for misinterpreting the purpose of a tool, while also acquiring a lifelong affection for chocolate. Spoon sets began to arrive on ribbons, each bowl a little smaller than its neighbor, the whole flock nesting with a musical chime that suggested order and faintly celebration. Their labels, 1/4 teaspoon, 1/2 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon, 1 tablespoon, were promises as much as facts. Gift givers favored them for newlyweds, perhaps sensing that successful marriages are negotiated 1 level teaspoon at a time. Some sets included the whimsical 1/8 teaspoon called a pinch, which is both precise and not, like a map that tells you the journey is about 9 songs long. Another included the smidgen, which has never once won a legal case, but has prevented many desserts from feeling undercared for. Drawers made room for these graduates by retiring a bent spoon to the honorable post of saucepan stirrer, where it could live out its days telling stories to steam. In cafe culture, the teaspoon learned its role as furniture for conversation. It tinked against ceramic cups in the rhythm of shared thought. It offered sugar to someone's tea and then, like a good host, avoided comment. In some cities, it remained the property of the saucer and traveled with it, which is the beginning of citizenship. In others, it took a job as messenger, clinking the side of a glass to summon attention when attention was already on its way. If a teaspoon could keep minutes, they would read like this: 1 for stirring, 2 for listening, 3 for deciding whether the coffee would appreciate a second sugar. Baristas develop the efficient twitch that sets a spoon to rest in exactly the same compass direction every time. Patrons develop the tiny ritual of wiping the spoon with the edge of a napkin because it made the world feel freshly ironed. Industrial design took interest. Stainless steel promised that teaspoons could enter dishwashers and return unchanged, which is a better trick than alchemy in most households. Manufacturers flirted with plastics. Plastics flirted back and then discovered that boiling water had opinions. Wooden teaspoons appeared in jars labeled with handwriting that looked excellent with sourdough. Restaurants, faced with theft as an accidental compliment, stamped their names on handles, and patrons created a small folkloric category called the spoon that came home in my pocket, which invariably became the most useful spoon in the drawer. Spoons from airplanes tried to be light without appearing insubstantial, a test they passed only some of the time. Through these experiments, the teaspoon kept its character, present, reliable, immune to manifesto. By the late 20th century, the world had almost agreed. In most places, a teaspoon meant 5 milliliters. Medicine bottles printed their dosage accordingly and attached little cups to prevent nostalgia from causing dosage. Cooking shows demonstrated the magical moment when the back of a knife met the spoon's rim and made a tiny whisper, half sigh, half agreement. Baking blogs, with their broad, generous paragraphs, added a sentence that might be the whole reason the internet was invented. Level your teaspoon. The advice arrived like a lullaby. It asked nothing extraordinary. It promised that the cookies you remember could come back if invited correctly. Everywhere, the teaspoon continued its patient diplomacy, bridging the gap between art and instruction. Of course, regional dialects persisted. An aunt somewhere in Naples still tells you to add quanto basta as much as needed, and hands you a teaspoon for orientation. A grandmother in Osaka gestures toward a small spoon that has no label because its identity rests in the way it rests in your hand. A baker in Dublin swears that a good teaspoon of vanilla means you should count 1, 2 while pouring, because vanilla enjoys applause. These are not errors. They're accents. The teaspoon knows when it is a number and when it is a kindness. It also knows that kitchens are theaters where even the understudies are beloved. A drawer closes. A pie begins to cool. Someone announces that the custard really was easier this time because measurements behaved as if they had received a gentle invitation instead of a summons. If politics can be found in textiles, it can also be found in drawers. Standard measures allowed cooks to send recipes to other towns without apologizing in the margins. Cookery schools rose on the expectation that a tablespoon in one classroom would be a tablespoon in another, which meant students could argue about flavor instead of furniture. Factories produced mixes that assumed teaspoons would pull their weight. Home bakers responded by turning boxes into birthday wishes with a whisk and a modest scoop. None of this makes headlines, which is why it keeps working. Civilization rarely announces itself. It hides in systems that promise, with the gravity of a whisper, that 3 teaspoons will indeed become 1 tablespoon, and that this truth will hold through winter. There were, as always, tiny rebellions. A fashionable cafe issued spoons with bowls so shallow they functioned as sarcasm. A designer released a set in which each spoon handle ended in a small square, declaring geometry where hospitality preferred curves. People tried them once and returned to the spoons that had already learned their hands. Anthropologists have made careers of watching which spoon a person chooses when 2 are available. The data suggests what family members already know. Everyone has a favorite, even if they can't explain why. It might be the way the light lifts on the rim, or the tiny imperfection that makes sugar hold on like a friendly bee. These preferences don't damage standardization. They decorate it. Some evenings ask for soup, and soup asks for spoons larger than honesty. But even there, the teaspoon appears, riding sidecar with pepper and finishing salt, measuring lemon juice for brightness, tasting for enough, like a diplomat who respects both nations and tongues. In pastry kitchens, the teaspoon tests glazes and anchors pastry bags in bowls like a considerate paperweight. In jam making, it skims foam with a calm hand, proving that even bubbles can be governed by infrastructure. In tea rituals from Marrakesh to Mumbai, the teaspoon throws light back to the window as if to say, the day has been measured, and we find it adequate. The future brings its own experiments. Smart spoons have been proposed. They beep. They light up. They object when submerged too long. The kitchen smiles indulgently and places them in a cup with spatulas until they calm down. Meanwhile, someone in a small apartment keeps a single spoon in a jar with their sugar and stirs a modest cup of coffee each dawn. Someone else owns 6 sets, but always reaches for the old, slightly bent one with the notch that keeps it from sliding into a mug, as if the mug had recruited it. Great movements declare themselves in manifestos. Small civilizations are content with habits. If you've drifted towards sleep, the teaspoon understands. It has always prospered in the company of the drowsy, the distracted, and the hopeful. Tomorrow morning, it will perform its exacting magic again. 5 milliliters of vanilla, or cocoa, or lemon, held without theater, leveled without ceremony, added without regret. Somewhere, a drawer will close with the soft music of nested metal. Somewhere else, a recipe will sigh, pleased to be legible across time and town. And somewhere, beneath the gentle clutter of breakfast, the little arithmetic of care will continue. 3 calm teaspoons marching toward 1 tablespoon like a very small parade that never needs spectators. You might not expect a small brass key to a cosmetics cabinet to hold more power than a war elephant, but in certain Mughal mornings, it quietly did. Behind screens patterned like gardens, you could water with your eyes, senior queens and favored. Ladies began the day with schedules that were less romantic than tidy. Lamps were trimmed. Adders were chosen with the solemnity of treaties. A scribe noted which vial of rose, which hint of vetiver, which thread of saffron would accompany which public appearance, because scent could persuade before speech arrived. If you're still awake by the time we compare 2 nearly identical shades of henna, feel free to subscribe, or let the thought drift away like smoke from a sandalwood cone. The palace will keep talking in a low voice either way. Cushions were fluffed to a standardized puff. Bracelets were tested for their bell-like discretion. The joke in some corridors was that the empire was ruled by doors that opened silently, and slippers that knew when not to make a sound. It is mildly absurd, but a ledger of pound ingredients sometimes forecast policy. A dash more clove on a festival day meant longer audiences. Mint meant shorter ones. Beetle intensified conversation, the way punctuation intensifies a sentence. People pretended not to notice such tiny barometers, and then noticed them with dedication. Life inside the women's quarters traveled at an even, deliberate pace. Tutors came with poetry in their pockets and etiquette in their eyebrows. A princess might practice handwriting beside a bowl of jasmines, each letter shaped like a petal promised to a future petition. Eunuch officials patrolled the administrative side like librarians who preferred order to drama. Their job was to move information across a boundary that respected itself. Musicians tuned quietly in the middle distance, not to entertain, but to encourage breathing. Tailors measured, not only for gowns and veils, but for the way cloth carried rank, because a brocade pattern was a sentence everyone could read. At mid-morning, petitions were summarized on slips of paper the size of almonds. A steward learned which tray to place them on, which tray was for matters that must never be framed as urgent, and which tray was for requests that would be better as gifts next month. If a parrot repeated a secret, the household made a gentle decision to teach it proverbs until it forgot the new trick. The daily corrections move this cushion an inch. Add 2 peppercorns to the goat stew. Shift the lattice so the sun arrives flattering and not interrogatory, where the palace's real machinery. One could tease that the empire ran on the distance. Between the rim of a coal pot and a steady hand, power in this world put on softer clothes. Access to the emperor was a geometry problem solved by women who understood light, timing, and courage. A queen did not command the calendar so much as curate it. She controlled when a festival appeared to be spontaneous. She decided which gift was a mood and which mood deserved a gift. A shawl shown at the right hour could postpone an argument. A poem recited when the lamps were first lit could make a decision step backward and try again later, more polite this time. People call this seduction as if it were a wind. It was closer to architecture. The luxury was plentiful, but it had jobs. A mother-of-pearl hook kept a curtain at exactly the angle that revealed a courtyard and concealed an accounting table. A mosaic pattern guided footsteps along a path that led past a garden tank full of cool water and toward a conversation, already softened by shade. Someone had weighed a ring and found it perfect for an apology. Another person had trained nightingales to sing at the moment when fragrance was strongest, which is the historical cousin of dimming the lights. The excess you hear about, the piles of cushions, the towers of fruit, were not aimless. They were tools as modest and frankly useful as a seal on a letter. The palace loved a whisper the way ink loves paper. Court histories mention hidden meetings and the tones people use to discuss weather that may or may not arrive. Sometimes the secret was simply a conversation on a balcony at an hour that agreed to be called late. Lanterns knew the code. 2 small flames meant send tea, 1 high flame meant send excuses, and a dark balcony meant send no questions. Messengers preferred routes that smelled like bread because everyone respects bakers. A tray could become a diplomatic pouch if a cloth covered it with enough confidence. It pleased officials to tell the story of a gardener who raised a ladder against the same wall every night for 20 years and thus became invisible by reliability. Lovers in these stories remain silhouettes. The details grow fainter the closer you approach them, the way moonlight forgets names. An anklet was supposedly left on a step like an intentionally misfiled document. A letter that began with a prayer may have ended with a map to a corridor. Did it happen this way? Perhaps. History in palaces is a careful mixture of fact and scenery. The most accurate sentence might be, people were alive in the evenings and they had thoughts. Some of those thoughts preferred unlisted hours, scandals, traveled faster than pigeons and slower than truth. A prince offered a jeweler's son a jewel not for the gem, but for the story it could purchase. And within a week, the story had bought itself new shoes. A rival faction interpreted a queen's new residence as an empire of intention. An embroidered hunting scene was said to hint at real hunts and real groves after sundown. Then someone noticed the deer had 7 legs, which made it art again. The court chroniclers could be dry and sharp at the same time. Certain fraternities of rumor danced with unusual vigor. One wrote, which is a delicate way of saying that people enjoyed themselves. Even the real political tempest coins stamped with a powerful queen's name, marriages arranged like chess problems. A general sulking at the wrong river arrived in the women's world as ripples against a steady shore when the emperor was captured and then released. The harem responded by inventorying lamps and repairing door latches, which is exactly the right thing to do when the world outside insists on performance. It is mildly funny to picture a scribe carefully noting that 4 blue bottles of indigo were moved from the linen room to the dye room on the same day someone swore they saw a mass visitor step through a moonbeam like it was a legal document training. And persuasion looked ordinary to anyone not paying attention. Queens and senior ladies learned which couplet dissolved a quarrel and which couplet encouraged one to declare its real subject. They curated birdsong and conversation the way a modern person curates playlists, choosing the slow raga for afternoons that needed care and the bright thumri for evenings that hoped to be remembered without effort. Food did work too. Tamarind, cold tempers. Cardamom lifted the ceiling of a room by half an inch. Saffron announced that someone had decided to be generous. The emperor was not hypnotized. He was hosted. Manipulation is the word outsiders use when they notice hospitality. Performing mathematics. A queen might suggest a charity by presenting its textiles first. She might sponsor a poet whose metaphors habitually landed near a political river. She might ask that a hunting bow be restrung and watch as an advisor reconsidered a plan with its tension removed. It sounds soft. It was exact. The administrative notes from those days have the serenity of perfect cursive, clean, legible, confident that ink can move mountains a grain at a time. Jealousy preferred props. A fan closed too crisply. A tray arrived 2 breaths too late. Someone wore a color that had been quietly claimed in a hallway last spring. These were small storms, and yet courtyards have their weather. The palace therefore invented countermeasures. A rotation chart prevented any one perfume from appearing 3 evenings in a row. Tasters sampled sherbets, not because poison was expected every hour, but because caution is a form of affection. The tasters had favorite spoons, incidentally bone-handled for cold drinks, silver for rose water, and a small jade one that made sherbet feel important. A rumor, always a hard worker, claimed that one wife slipped a bitter seed into another's cup. A matron answered by announcing that bitter seeds would be used openly and only in medicine. If the patient recovered, gratitude went to the matron. If not, blame went to the garden. This is what governance looks like up close, the steady conversion of drama into policy. In a corner, a calligrapher copied verses about trust with strokes so thin you can mistake them for threads. The queens who rewrote love and power did it with stationery and stone. One issued decrees from behind a screen and stamped them with her own seal, which is a very particular kind of sentence in a world where seals were not supposed to wander. She built gardens that edited the summer. She sponsored sarais on hot roads so travelers could find evening even at noon. Another, a princess instead of a wife, adopted a market and filled it with light. The market still argues with darkness. Every night on her behalf, a favorite consort turned absence into architecture so convincingly that people today visit a city of white to study a feeling she left behind. A scholar princess waived some taxes because she believed learning should not count as cargo. The imperial accountants who admired rules the way musicians admire rhythm found a way to agree. A poetess wrote verses that asked enormous questions in a voice that sounded like someone refolding a scarf. None of this required a trumpet. It required a desk, a garden plan, a taste for scholarships that endured beyond the fashion for particular jewels. Power that lingers after its bracelets are sold usually owned more books than rings. What people call decline sometimes begins as routine. Ceremonies multiplied because ceremonies had always worked. A festival asked for 20 lanterns, then 25, then 25 with colored glass, and no one argued because light is friendly. Costs learned to walk briskly. A campaign needed funding. A garden needed repairs. The treasury blotted a figure and wrote another. Foreign companies began arriving with ledgers that could stare down a mountain. The court adjusted the way courts will by adding dances and debates and ingredients to the pawn that might make a victory taste nearer. Desire, which had once sufficiently arranged calendars and calmed quarrels, found itself accused of spending too much time polishing mirrors. The accusation was convenient and not quite honest. The real burdens were long roads, expensive wars, stubborn harvests, and the mathematics of silver. Yet myths prefer velvet to spreadsheets. The idea that too much pleasure weakened an empire became popular because it requires no footnotes and turns moral judgment into an easy bedtime story. You can hear it any time people explain complicated events with a single sigh. If you listen softly, you will notice that the women's world kept solving small problems, even while large ones refused to be soluble on schedule. Floods, release stores of grain and reopen a garden gate to the poor. Shortages of thread, reorder spinning shifts until the nightingales to rest so their feed can be redirected to the kitchens. Disputes between musicians, rotate rags, institute. Pauses, offer mangoes at the fourth song. These footnotes never make dramatic histories, though they helped real people sleep. The routines outlived the rumors. A favorite story says that a queen, hearing that a rival faction had produced another scandal, asked only whether the lamps had been trimmed for the evening. The answer was yes. She smiled the way accountants do when columns add up. The legacy of those careful rooms is stranger and kinder than the tales of intrigue suggest. Recipes with measured saffron still travel by memory across kitchens. A market still glows because a princess decided light should be an inheritance. A charity still names a scholarship after a woman who preferred endowments to diamonds. The quiet mathematics of access, who enters when, who speaks after whom, where cushions rest. How long a pause should last has become the hidden grammar of meetings everywhere. Even the rumors have softened into stories that keep people company. On long walks, queens, consorts, daughters, widows, adults with agency, taste, limits, and plans spent their days tuning the empire's feelings until those feelings began to hum on their own. Their instruments were not mysterious. They were pauses, perfumes, poems, and the patient belief that good order could make better kindness. If sleep has reached you, that is correct. The palace is quieter now. A clerk closes a ledger about lamp oil. A parrot recites a proverb to itself and decides it is wise enough for one evening. In a courtyard, the last bowl of rosewater gives up its perfume to the air like a well-meaning footnote. The brass key to the cosmetics cabinet returns to its hook where it looks like a very small moon. Somewhere a thoughtful hand lowers a screen, not to conceal anything, but to let the night accumulate. And somewhere, far from rumor, nearer to routine, a careful woman chooses tomorrow's couplet, confident that a quiet sentence can still move a city a few inches toward gentleness. You might not expect a folded veil to carry more diplomatic weight than a cavalry regiment, but in certain Mughal mornings, it quietly did. The day began before the light had fully remembered itself, with servants moving like punctuation marks through corridors of carved stone, opening lattice one by one so air could practice being cool. In the women's world, the first tasks were steady and not scandalous at all. Lamps trimmed, copper basins filled, trays of pain arranged in their careful geometry of leaves and lime and clove. A senior matron inspected perfumes with a seriousness of a treaty. Rose for audiences, jasmine for letters, vetiver for heat. If you're still awake by the time we compare two almost identical shades of henna, you may subscribe or not. It will be our small secret either way, folded and put aside like a pleasant handkerchief. Tutors arrived with verses tucked into memory. There were ledgers for fabrics where the word sky recurred too often to be accidental. In one corner, a eunuch official, part librarian and part door, practiced the art of moving information across thresholds without letting any of the steps make a sound. Behind the veil, the myth went, all passion. Under the veil, in truth, a schedule. A palace can be romantic with one hand and procedural with the other. Life inside this ornate geometry followed its slow music. The curriculum was broad because power demanded it. Calligraphy to study the hand, accounts to study the argument, poetry to study the face in public. A lover of detail might have enjoyed the storage room where silver anklets slept, each tagged with a ribbon labeled in neat Persian, or the pantry where sherbet spoons, bone for cold, silver for rosewater weighted and fitted niches like obedient. Fish. A queen's reputation could rise or fall on whether cushions were arranged to show hospitality without surrendering the geometry of rank. Luxury wasn't waste. It was grammar. A brocade pattern could say sister, where another said guest, and a third, with almost the same weave, said, please return tomorrow with a better idea. The emperor's attention, which historians call the sun for convenience, shone on those who knew when to open the lattice and let it in. The slow joke of the palace was that a truly powerful woman rarely raised her voice. She arranged, the way an astronomer arranges not stars, but instruments, desire in this setting, or slippers. The chronicles that pretend to be shocked by. The perversions of queens are often hungrier for adjectives than for facts. Yet even the driest of court records admit that access to the emperor's hours passed through rooms that women curated. And curation is not a passive verb. A shawl shown at the right hour could delay a quarrel. A couplet murmured over tea could escort a bad policy to the door with dignity. Attar was not merely fragrance. It was an atmosphere in which decisions either softened or sharpened. The women kept weather. At dusk, the corridor might breathe sandalwood for generosity, and on difficult evenings, frankincense for focus, which is the closest pre-modern equivalent to adjusting the brightness on a screen. In the idiom of the time, a perverted queen might simply have been the person who understood that a festival's lighting plan could shorten a dangerous meeting by 20 minutes. Such quiet edits are the tiny hinges of large doors. Rumor preferred moonlight. The second world of the palace, its network of secret meetings and hidden night visits, grew from the first not by rebellion but by proximity. If a queen wanted to see a scholar at an unlisted hour, she could arrange the pretext of a poetry recital on a balcony where the river of night ran slowly and the apartment beyond smelled of cardamom and small books. Lamps became a code. 2 small flames meant send tea. 1 tall flame meant send excuses. A dark balcony meant send no questions. Messengers knew the safest routes were those that smelled like bread. You can still hide a letter in a baker's grin. One tale, repeated for centuries because it harms no one, tells of a gardener who leaned a ladder against the same wall every evening until people stopped seeing him, at which point he carried more news than a pigeon without, ever once pretending to be important. Another describes an anklet left on a step like a misfiled document. The clerk who found it recorded the weight, the metal, the number of small bells, and then added a note that the anklet had been returned to the Office of Ornaments, which is the most bureaucratic sentence to ever occur in a love story. Scandals walked more slowly than gossip, and that is how they lasted. A princess wrote a commentary on Sufi metaphors, and a pamphlet insisted this prove she was practicing them after dark. A consort fostered a neighborhood market with lanterns, and the same pamphlet asked whether flames can ever be trusted. Court. Chroniclers who had to write with both honesty and self-preservation used the careful phrase, certain fraternities of rumor danced with unusual vigor. Was there a midnight visit? Possibly. Were there meetings about libraries disguised as garden strolls? Often. The real calendar of forbidden affairs tends to look like a schedule of poetry lessons that ran long, conversations about irrigation that migrated to cooler rooms, or charitable endowments negotiated over sherbet when the city slept. Even the genuinely reckless episodes, someone too public in a window, someone else careless with a letter tend to resolve into furniture. A screen moved a fraction, a cushion placed where a chair should have been, a tray brought too quickly and then sent away with too much speed. The palace had a talent for converting narrative into upholstery, the third world desire, as chess belonged to queens who understood that attention is a currency that appreciates when invested wisely. Manipulation is what outsiders call it, when hospitality performs mathematics. A woman might suggest a policy by praising a charity's textiles, which were coincidentally woven in a region that needed roads. Another might sponsor a singer whose favorite metaphors landed near a political river. A third might give a gift of hunting bows that were slightly easier to draw than last year's, and the emperor, practicing, might find his arguments relaxing by the same small degree. It was not hypnosis, it was ergonomics. Humility was also a tool. A strong queen knew when to declare herself merely a custodian of other people's wisdom, and when to be the generous owner of her own. Coins whisper about this. For a brief, glittering Interval, pieces of silver carried Nur Jahan's name beside her husband's, an everyday proof that authority could be struck, weighed, and passed from palm to palm. Rivalry preferred props, fans snapped a little too quickly. Pomegranates arrived late to the same 3 apartments. Someone wore a color that had been unofficially claimed last season in a hallway that faced east. Tasters, always the palaces. Calmest people sampled sherbets with a professionalism that made melodrama look silly. Their favorite spoons, jade for prestige, bone for purity, rested between sips like judges who had surrendered to mercy. Poison existed mostly in imagination and occasionally in the pharmacy, where antidotes sat in tidy rows. Musk, camphor, bizarre stones with biographies longer than some generals. Powders labeled in a script so elegant you felt better by simply reading it. A rumor insisted that a bitter seed appeared in a rival's cup. A matron answered by announcing that bitter seeds would henceforth be used only in medicine, and then published the list of approved ingredients for sherbet as if she were printing a constitution. The palace's true magic lay in such conversions. Of heat into rule dot beyond intrigue, legacies accumulated with the patience of shade. A princess built a caravanserai so travelers could rest even when time refused. People still sleep under its principles. Another woman endowed a market and offered it lanterns that argued gently with darkness every night. Some queens wrote. Their lines about love contained footnotes about ethics. Others collected. Their libraries grew into neighborhoods of thought that continued to feed students long after particular bracelets had been pawned. A few became architects of feeling. We visit a white city by a river and think of loss. We forget that an artist first taught the stone how to speak, and that the teacher was a woman who understood how memory prefers rooms that echo softly. It would be easy to label these figures with modern categories: feminist, reformer, scandal maker, but the quieter truth is that they practiced an adult competence in a world that tried, often and with floral politeness, to call competence. A rumor dot the old story that desire toppled an empire is the neatest bedtime narrative of economics ever written. It asks the listener to mistake lanterns for ledgers, shawls for supply lines, perfumes for coin flows. The large weights were elsewhere. Long wars that charged interest, silver that refused to arrive on time, trade winds with moods, harvests that needed consolation, and ambitious companies whose ledgers could outstare mountains. Pleasure was accused because pleasure cannot file a rebuttal. And yet, within the accusation, there is an unintentional compliment. For if tenderness, song, and pawn truly could undo a state, then tenderness, song, and pawn must be very strong indeed. The truth is simpler. The palace survived by routine long, after philosophies had started to wobble. When floods came, storerooms opened. When prices rose, festivals trimmed 2 lanterns and claimed virtue for the savings. When a general sulked by the wrong river, a queen rearranged audiences so optimism could borrow a few extra afternoons. Even on evenings when rumor stood at the door wearing a new outfit, the rooms kept their civility. Lamps learned the night by heart. Parrots practiced proverbs until they sounded like minutes. A scribe wrote, 2 jars of indigo moved from linen to dye. 5 baskets of mangoes redirected to musicians to prevent quarrels. 4 petitions received. None urgent, 3 disguised as poetry. A clerk who loved order gathered anklets for cleaning and found a note tucked into 1 ribbon, a couplet about patience and rain. He logged it as anonymous advice, which felt correct. Somewhere in the deeper quiet, a queen composed another small edit to Tomorrow. Slight change in the seating for afternoon recitations. A request that the lime in the pan soften argument instead of sharpening it. An endowment to a hospice. On a dusty road, scandal remained available to anyone who needed it for conversation. Power remained available to anyone who could breathe evenly. If you are still with us, the palace is almost entirely lamp now. The screens remember the last fingertips and let the air borrow them. Outside, a guard counts the stars, not because he does not trust them, but because numbers lower his heart by 1 beat per 5. Inside, a brass key to a cosmetics cabinet returns to its hook like a very small moon. The old gardens hum with low water. A market glows far away because a princess decided that light should be an inheritance. The women's rooms, rumored and described and misrepresented for centuries, resume their favorite occupation, converting noise into routine, taking sharp moods and wrapping them in linen, hanging tomorrow's garments where they can stretch, overnight into better temper. Somewhere a thoughtful hand chooses a couplet for dawn, confident that a quiet sentence can persuade a busy empire to behave, at least until the second tray of tea. And if sleep has finally arrived, it will find the palace ready, with 1 lamp left burning for housekeeping, 1 note on the desk about lantern oil, and 1 soft promise that the veil, when lifted in the morning, will reveal nothing urgent, only schedules pretending to be scenery. You might not expect a silk curtain to function like a legal document, but in the Mughal palaces, it often did exactly that, politely deciding who counted and who didn't with the quiet authority of woven threads. The morning behind the curtain started early and slow, the way starch relaxes in warm water. Lamps were trimmed, trays arranged, slippers aligned into pairs that looked as if they had been rehearsing. Attendants moved in well-practiced routes that would have satisfied any city planner, past basins of rose water that held the faint geometry of yesterday's fingers. If you're still awake by the time we compare the minor differences among 13 near-identical combs, you may subscribe or simply fall asleep in moral protest. Both are acceptable outcomes here. The harem, which travelers wrote down, with many adjectives and very little footwork, was less a carnival than a calendar. Chaperones, eunuchs, with the tact of librarians, kept tallies, lists, and keys, the small coins of order. Even Desire had office hours, and a clerk with a neat hand daubed the rooms loved their own surfaces. A courtyard favored shade at a specific hour as if it had learned the habit from a former resident. A corridor breathed sandalwood all summer and cloves in the monsoon. A window gave to the same slice of sky regardless of the season, which is something not everyone can promise. In the storeroom, brocade and muslin lay folded like obedient arguments, each labeled in Persian script so fine that even a complaint would have appeared courteous. Perfumes were not just perfumes, they were instruments. Rose meant audiences, jasmine meant letters, and vetiver meant the conversation will be longer than expected. Please send sherbet. There were ledgers of bracelets, ledgers of hairpins, ledgers of ledgers. A queen who wished to appear serene did not simply put on serenity. She found it in a specific drawer, the one beside the box of emerald tassels that were only worn on days with legal petitions. Luxury here was a kind of syntax. A misplaced cushion could create a misunderstanding, and a velvet shawl thrown carelessly across the wrong chair might be read as a treaty that nobody remembered signing. People outside wrote that the women behind the curtain were prisoners of passion, which shows a touching faith in the efficiency of passion. In truth, control was the secret luxury, decisions made with slow hands at the center of a vast kingdom. A consort might ask for a hunting account, and buried between antelope tallies and arrow repairs would be the note that a particular road bridge needed attention. Another might host a recital where the chosen raga, elaborated at an unhurried pace, stood in for a budget discussion that could not be conducted in the public square. Desire, under such management, wore cotton in the morning and silk at dusk. It was dressed precisely for its tasks, which included smoothing the edges of policy and escorting unwelcome ideas gently back to the garden. When the emperor's attention, an object we called the sun, only because it moves entered the women's apartments. It behaved. Don't underestimate cushions that have been correctly fluffed. History sometimes does dot if the morning belonged. To grammar, the night belonged to punctuation. Lamps became the commas and colons of a private language. 2 small flames meant send music. A tall flame near the lattice meant send excuses. And a dark balcony meant send nobody. At all, even if they have practiced being invisible. Gardeners, who were excellent at traveling unnoticed, carried messages disguised as copper watering cans. There is a story handed down because it embarrasses no one, of an anklet placed deliberately on the 3rd step of a stair silver 11. Bells, one cracked and a clerk cataloging it with such care that a poet later dedicated a verse to the entry number. Another tells of a ladder leaned nightly against the same jasmine wall until it became part of the scenery, which is the safest disguise any object can wear. Night meetings were not dramatic, they were logistical. A balcony that overlooked the river of air became a neutral office. Shawls served as minutes. A parrot who had mastered 3 couplets of Hafez kept watch more effectively than any guard, because people behave around parrots the way they do around ink, carefully and with the slight dread of permanence. Scandals work more slowly than gossip, which is why they lasted longer. A princess wrote marginal notes in a theological treatise, and a pamphleteer converted the notes into proof of midnight transgression. A consort endowed a street market with lanterns that refused to go out in rain, and a sour observer suggested the lamps were really signposts for secret meetings, as if onions and dates were recruited into a conspiracy. When something truly untidy occurred, and palaces are, among many occupations, factories of untidiness, it often resolved into furniture. A screen shifted the width of a hand. A cushion appeared where a stool should have stood. A tray arrived too quickly, then retreated too fast, leaving behind the smell of nutmeg and inconvenience. The bureaucrats handled this with their favorite weapon, lists. There is a docket of unauthorized movements of trays in one chronicle, and the tone implies that trays are the real danger to empires, not battles, influence which outsiders. Call manipulation when they didn't think of it first, traveled in practical clothes. A queen might suggest a policy by praising a carpet wearers' guild. Soon the guild had a grant. The weavers had work, the border town had roads, and the emperor had an evening of agreeable compliments about artistic taste. Another might sponsor a singer whose lyrical metaphors leaned near a political river until the river found itself supervised by poetry. Nur Jahan, celebrated and condemned in equal proportion, arranged coins with her name beside her husband's. Nothing seduces a treasurer like the possibility of tidier accounts. Sometimes power chose small doors. A consort sent hunting bows that were, through discreet engineering, a little easier to draw. Practice sessions grew longer. Discussions about a campaign's budget shortened by the same handful of crucial minutes. The palace made time the way a cook makes yogurt, in warm rooms with patience without an audience. Of the rivalries, people prefer the weather report to the map. Colors were claimed as territories. A certain pomegranate dye belonged to one lineage of affection. Another shade of indigo meant we wish the conversation to be long, but not serious. Fans snapped with code, which sounds a little theatrical and was, but it worked on warm afternoons when everyone wished to be declarative with minimal effort. Tasters performed their calm work with spoons that resembled talisman's bone for purity, jade for prestige, silver for show, and kept the pharmacy's antidotes alphabetically: amber, bezoar, camphor, cinnamon. Poison existed largely in literature, and occasionally in kitchen mistakes. The more dependable hazards were bruised feelings and mismanaged seating charts. The antidote to those ailments was documented: a picnic, a new garden bench shade-tested in late morning, a recitation of verses that use the word patience every 2 stanzas. One matron published a list of approved ingredients for sherbet in months of heat and thereby removed 3 potential scandals. It is difficult to betray someone over a drink with regulated sugar dot. It would be easy, and sometimes the easiest. Path is the only one available at midnight to imagine these women as engineers of appetite alone, yet their legacies insist otherwise. With the stubborn politeness of stone, travelers still find caravanserais endowed by princesses, built for the humble miracle of east-west trade resting its eyelids. Markets carry the smell of lamp oil that once belonged to a queen's charity. Lanterns still practice not going out. Libraries seated by women grew into neighborhoods of opinion where poets debated jurists, and both groups forgot to be suspicious about the bread. Some queens composed. Their lines about love refused to stop speaking about justice at the last possible moment. Others collected. A set of Korans, copied by extraordinary hands, bears notes in a woman's margins, prudent as water. Still others chose monuments, the white city by a river that insists on sorrow, the garden that moves through seasons as if they were musical modes, and by choosing them, they convince stone to memorize tenderness. The past can be dramatic, but it prefers not to be when given a choice. The suggestion that desire alone toppled an empire is tidy enough to be suspicious. Accounts resisted the romance. Silver misbehaved on sea routes. Armies adopted the expensive habit of existing. A company from far away arrived with ledgers that could stare down a mountain. Monsoons, those great auditors, cross-examined the roads every year and found weakness. Our queens continued to practice management through the porrages of reality. Famine kitchens with cumin that comforted more than it flavored. Price caps on ghee that made merchants sigh. Scholarships for the polite science of irrigation. Pleasure was never the villain. It just happened to live at the same address as responsibility. The blame for a failing wall often falls on the murals because they are easier to point at than the foundations. Meanwhile, ordinary days kept behaving. A scribe logged the transits of small things. 2 baskets of mangoes reassigned to musicians to prevent quarrels. 4 petitions received, of which 3 disguised as poetry. 1 jar of indigo relocated from linen to dye by general consensus. A clerk with a profound love of order collected anklets for cleaning, noted the weight of each, and tucked a couplet into the ribbon of a troublesome one, which may have been the empire's quietest policy memo. Parrots recited legal maxims until the guards relaxed, which is how parrots perform security. Children in the outer courts learned to measure afternoons by the length of shadows on the jasper steps, a technique that remains accurate even after dynasties forget themselves. The palace's anxious machines keys, calendars, and corridors went on ensuring that surprises remained at the correct size. On certain evenings, rumor dressed as certainty and asked to be seated. The rooms responded with civility. A tray of pan arrived, accompanied by a list of ingredients for transparency. A curtain adjusted its height in compliance with tradition. Someone mentioned, quite casually, that the eunuch superintendent had audited the fan inventory and found it exemplary. This was not cynicism, it was craft. Good order does not remove longing. It arranges it so that longing accomplishes work. Between sighs. The Mughals were enthusiastic students of such arrangement, especially their queens, who knew that affection can be a blunt instrument but is better used as a set of measuring spoons. If you're still with us, and perhaps you have drifted and returned, which is the recommended method for this subject. The palace is now mostly lamp. Stars practice patience over the river. A brass key turns with the contentment of a small moon. A matron writes a note to tomorrow about citron peel for the sherbet. A poet turns a compliment into a budget. A queen asks that the musicians tune. Lower, because lower notes help the city forgive itself. Somewhere beyond the curtains that would like to be thought of only as fabric, there is a plan to redirect a market's profits into a hospice, a request to move a bench 2 paces into the shade, and the softest possible order to deliver new shawls to the widows of a regiment. Scandals available for anyone who requires it to warm their hands. So is kindness, filed under recurring expense. Toward midnight, the veils remember everything they have seen and fold themselves with professional forgetfulness. The perfumes align themselves for morning rose for audiences, jasmine for letters, vetiver for the days when he insists on being the loudest person in the room. A scribe, the last to leave, closes the ledger of anklets with a fondness that sounds like a sigh, and notes, almost as an afterthought, that the moon appeared briefly in the copper basin and minded nobody's business. Outside, the city hums in a key the palace knows by heart. Inside, the rooms return to their favorite hobby, converting noise into routine, converting rumor into menus, converting desire into seeing charts that make sense. Tomorrow will be another long day of small edits. The curtain will draw itself. With the gravity of an old habit, someone will choose the correct shawl for a delicate conversation that wishes to be about carpets and is actually about taxes. And if you've fallen asleep somewhere between the spoon inventory and the lamp, codes, that is exactly how the queens would have wanted their power to operate, almost invisibly, with good manners and at a pace kind to the heart.